The chains around her wrists told a story that no one wanted to hear. In the dim cargo hold of the Iron Promise, Alina Rossetti sat among barrels of grain and bolts of fabric. Her own name written on a manifest not as a passenger, but as property. The ship's ledger listed her between a crate of tea and a barrel of molasses, valued at 43 pounds sterling. But one man would see what others refused to recognize, and his choice would rewrite both their destinies forever. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The November wind cut through the rigging of the Iron Promise like a blade through canvas, sending spray across the deck where Thomas Hayes knelt beside a splintered rail. His hands moved with practiced precision, fitting new wood against old. But his mind wandered to the cargo manifest he had glimpsed that morning. Among the usual listings of goods bound for Boston Harbor, one entry had made him pause. A young woman's name, written in the same column as freight, with a price beside it that made his stomach turn. Tom had worked merchant ships for 8 years, long enough to know that not all cargo walked on 2 legs, and not all passengers were listed as human beings. The practice was legal, barely hidden behind contracts and debt agreements that bound people as surely as iron chains. The legal had never meant right in Tom's mind, and tonight the distinction felt sharper than the Atlantic wind against his face. He secured the final board and gathered his tools, listening to the familiar sounds of a ship at sea. Rope straining against wood, canvas snapping in the breeze, the steady rhythm of waves against the hull. Below deck, he knew Captain Blackwood would be reviewing tomorrow's rations, calculating profit margins, with the same cold precision he applied to everything else. The captain saw the world in terms of cargo and payment, weight and space. People were simply another commodity to be transported efficiently and delivered intact. Tom descended into the ship's belly, past the crew quarters, and through the narrow corridor that led to the cargo hold. The air grew thick with the smell of preserved meat and damp wood. But something else lingered beneath it. Fear, resignation, the quiet breathing of people trying to remain invisible. The hold was divided into sections by heavy canvas curtains, separating different types of goods from each other. Tom had legitimate business here, checking the wooden supports that kept cargo from shifting during rough weather. But as he worked, his eyes searched the shadows between crates and barrels until he found what he was looking for. She sat in a space barely wide enough for her shoulders, her back against a water barrel, and her knees drawn up to her chest. Dark hair had come loose from whatever arrangement it once held, falling across a face that might have been beautiful if not for the exhaustion that shadowed her features. The iron shackles around her wrists were connected to a chain that disappeared. Behind the barrel, anchoring her to the ship's structure like any other piece of valuable cargo. Alina Rossetti looked up when Tom's shadow fell across her, and for a moment neither of them moved. Her eyes held no plea for help, no desperate hope that rescue might come. They held only the weary acceptance of someone who had learned not to expect kindness from strangers. But Tom saw something else there too, something that the manifest had missed entirely. Intelligence, dignity, a spirit that had been bent but not broken. He knelt beside her, setting his tool bag on the deck with deliberate care. The sound echoed in the narrow space, and Alina flinched slightly, as if expecting punishment for drawing attention to herself. Tom noticed the way she held her left, shoulder higher than her right, the careful way she breathed, and the fading bruise along her jawline that spoke of recent rough handling. "Miss Rossetti," he said quietly, reading the name from a tag tied to her chain with twine. The words felt wrong in his mouth, too formal for someone shackled like livestock, too casual for someone whose freedom had been stolen. "I'm Tom Hayes. I work on this ship." She studied his face in the dim light, searching for some clue about his intentions. When she spoke, her voice carried the faint accent of someone who had learned English as a second language. But her words were precise and clear. "If you are here to check that the cargo is secure, Mr. Hayes, you can see that I am not going anywhere." The bitterness in her tone was earned, Tom realized. How many men had looked at her in the past weeks, calculating her value like a piece of furniture or a bag of grain? How many had seen the chains and simply accepted them as the natural order of things. Tom reached into his tool bag and withdrew a small metal file, the kind used for smoothing rough edges on wood. Elena's eyes widened as she understood what he intended, but she shook her head quickly. "They will know," she whispered. "Captain Blackwood checks the chains every morning. If they are damaged, he will know someone helped me, and they will throw you overboard for theft of cargo." "Then we'll have to be clever about it," Tom replied, examining the lock that held her shackles closed. "These chains weren't made by a master locksmith. They're meant to hold someone who doesn't fight back." He looked at her directly, seeing past the dirt and exhaustion to the person beneath. "But you're not cargo, Miss Rossetti. Whatever contract or debt brought you here, whatever they wrote on that manifest, you're not property to be bought and sold." Lena stared at him for a long moment, and Tom saw the exact instant when something shifted behind her eyes. Not yet, but perhaps the memory of what hope had once felt like. Alina watched Tom work on her shackles with the methodical patience of someone who understood that haste would only create noise and suspicion. The file moved against the metal, in tiny, measured strokes, each sound muffled by the cloth Tom had wrapped around both the tool and the chain. Above them, the ship creaked and groaned through the Atlantic swells, providing cover for their quiet rebellion against Captain Blackwood's manifest. "Tell me about Boston," Tom said softly as he worked, wanting to keep her mind occupied, and her voice low. "What waits for you there?" Lena's laugh held no humor. "A man named Vincent Aldrich, 47 years old, owner of 3 textile mills, and widower with 2 children he cannot manage. My father owed him money for wool shipments that never arrived. When the debt came due, Mr. Aldrich proposed a solution that would clear the books and provide him with a new wife in a single transaction." Tom's hand paused on the file. "Your father agreed to this?" "My father died of fever last winter. My mother made the agreement because the alternative was debtor's prison for the entire family." Lena's voice remained steady, but Tom caught the tightness around her eyes. "Aldrich paid our debts and purchased passage for me to America. I am to arrive in Boston as his contracted bride, legally bound to marry him within 30 days of landing or face deportation back to England." The lock mechanism gave way with a soft click, and Elena's right hand came free. She stared at her wrist in amazement, rubbing the raw skin where iron had pressed against flesh for weeks. Tom moved to the second shackle, but Elena caught his arm. "Mr. Hayes, you do not understand what you are risking. If Captain Blackwood discovers this, he will not simply punish you. He will have you arrested for theft when we reach Boston. In the eyes of the law, you will have stolen valuable property." Tom met her gaze directly. "Miss Rossetti, I've spent 8 years watching this ship carry human misery across the ocean, telling myself it wasn't my business, as long as I kept my head down and did my work. But tonight, looking at you chained between barrels like a piece of furniture, I realized something. The moment I walked away and pretended not to see, I became part of the machinery that put you here." The second lock opened, and Elena's hands were free for the first time since leaving Liverpool.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
She flexed her fingers slowly, as if testing whether they still belonged to her. Tom gathered the chains carefully, examining the locks he had opened. "These will need to look untampered with when the captain makes his morning inspection," he said, thinking aloud. "The mechanism is simple enough to reset, but you'll have to wear them again." Alina nodded, understanding the necessity. "How long do we have? 6 more days to Boston Harbor? But we need a better plan than just hiding damaged locks." Tom sat back on his heels, his mind working through possibilities. "There are ways off a ship besides walking down the gangplank in Boston." "You mean jumping overboard?" Elena's eyes widened. "Mr. Hayes, this is the North Atlantic in November. The water would kill us in minutes. Not overboard. Smaller boats. Every merchant ship carries emergency craft in case of disaster. We could reach one during a storm, when the crew is distracted." Tom trailed off, seeing the fear in Elena's expression. "I know it sounds desperate. It sounds like suicide." Alina leaned against the water barrel, fatigue evident in every line of her body. "Even if we somehow reach shore alive, where would we go? I have no money, no family in America, no skills that would allow me to survive on my own. And you would. Be a wanted man? A fugitive from justice? Tom was quiet for a moment, listening to the ship move through the waves. When he spoke again, his voice carried a certainty that surprised them both. My brother owns a carpentry shop in Philadelphia. He's been asking me to leave the ships and work with him for years. If we could reach Philadelphia instead of Boston, if we could disappear for long enough to start new lives. He looked at Alina directly. I'm not talking about rescue, Miss Rossetti. I'm talking about partnership. It's people helping each other build something better than what they're running from. Alina stared at him as if he had spoken in a foreign language. You would give up your life on these ships for a stranger? Risk imprisonment or worse? For someone whose debt you didn't create? I've been thinking about leaving the ships anyway. This life, moving cargo and goods from one port to another, never staying anywhere long enough to build something lasting, it's wearing thin. Tom began resetting the lock mechanisms, his hand steady, despite the magnitude of what he was proposing. As for being strangers, we've got 6 days to change that. Alina watched him work, her mind clearly racing through implications and possibilities. And if your brother refuses to help, if the authorities track us to Philadelphia, if this entire plan leads to nothing but our deaths. Tom finished with the locks and looked at her seriously. Then at least we'll have tried to write our own story instead of letting other people write it for us. The ship lurched suddenly as it crested a larger wave, and Tom steadied himself against the barrel. The distance they could hear first. Mate Samuel Cross shouting orders to adjust the sails. The weather was changing, and Tom realized that might work in their favor. There's something else, Alina said quietly. Something I haven't told you about Mr. Aldrich and his business arrangements? Tom waited, sensing that whatever she was about to reveal would change everything. He doesn't just operate textile mills, according to the letters my mother received. He also facilitates the transport of contracted workers from Europe to America. People like me, bound by debt agreements that amount to legalized slavery. Elena's voice dropped to a whisper. I am not his first contracted bride, Mr. Hayes. I am simply the newest addition to a collection. The implications hit Tom like a physical blow. Lena wasn't just one woman escaping an unwanted marriage. She was evidence of a larger system, one that trapped people in cycles of debt and forced service. Helping her escape wouldn't just be saving one person. It would be disrupting a profitable enterprise that depended on human misery. Tom felt something shift inside himself, a recognition that this moment would define who he chose to be for the rest of his life. He could reset the locks, walk away, and continue his existence as a man who built things with his hands, but never challenged the systems that destroyed people's lives. Or he could choose to become someone who acted when action mattered most. 6 days, he said firmly, reaching out to help Alina position the loosened shackles around her wrists. 6 days to plan, prepare, and find our courage. Alina looked into his eyes and saw something that had been absent from every interaction she'd had since leaving England. She saw someone who looked at her and saw a person worth saving. Not because of what she could provide, but because of who she was. 6 days, she agreed, and for the first time in months, Alina Rossetti began to believe that her story might have a different ending than the one written in Captain Blackwood's manifest. The storm arrived 3 days ahead of schedule, bringing with it winds that howled through the rigging like banshees, and waves that lifted the iron promise before slamming her back into the Atlantic. With bone-jarring force, Tom had felt the change in the ship's rhythm hours before Captain Blackwood acknowledged it. The subtle shift in how she rode the swells that spoke of weather moving in fast from the northwest. Alina gripped the water barrel as the ship pitched, violently to starboard, her stomach rebelling against the constant motion. The shackles around her wrists had been carefully repositioned each morning before Captain Blackwood's inspection. But now they felt heavier than ever as she struggled to maintain her balance in the cramped space between cargo containers. Around her, barrels groaned against their restraints and boxes shifted despite the rope nets holding them in place. Tom appeared at the entrance to her section of the hold, his face grim with news that Alina could read before he spoke. Dripped from his hair and clothes, evidence that he had been topside assessing the storm's severity. Behind him, she could hear the shouts of crew members struggling to secure loose equipment and adjust. Sail configurations for the worsening conditions. We need to move up our timeline, he said without preamble, crouching beside her as the ship rolled through another massive wave. This storm is going to get worse before it gets better, and Captain Blackwood just ordered all contracted passengers confined to the hold until we reach calmer waters. Alina felt her heart sink. Confined how? Additional chains? Crossbars? Welded across the section entrances. He's worried about people panicking and interfering with storm operations. Tom's jaw tightened. But there's something else. I overheard him talking to First Mate Cross about contingency plans. The ship lurched again, and Tom braced himself against the barrel. When he continued, his voice carried an urgency that made Elena's blood run cold. If the storm damages the ship badly enough, if we start taking on water faster than the pumps can handle, Blackwood has orders to jettison non-essential cargo to reduce weight and improve stability. Tom met her eyes directly. Lena the contracted. Passengers are classified as non-essential cargo. The words hit her like a physical blow. She understood immediately what Tom was telling her. In a crisis, Captain Blackwood would choose to sacrifice the people chained in the hold rather than risk losing his ship and the more valuable freight. It was a calculation as cold and practical as everything else about this voyage. How long do we have? She asked, surprised by the steadiness of her own voice. Hours, not days. Cross is already gathering the materials to install the additional restraints. Once those are in place, getting out of here becomes nearly impossible. Tom reached into his tool bag and withdrew several items Alina hadn't seen before. A small crowbar, a coil of thin rope, and what looked like a waterproof satchel. But the storm also gives us cover. Half the crew is focused on keeping us afloat, and the other half is securing cargo in the forward holds. Alina watched him check the contents of the satchel, noting the careful way he had wrapped everything in oiled cloth. This wasn't a plan. Conceived in desperation, Tom had been preparing for days, thinking through details she hadn't even considered. The emergency boat, she said, understanding dawning. You've already prepared one? Tom nodded. The smallest longboat on the port side near the stern. I've been modifying it during my regular maintenance duties, adding extra provisions and making sure the hull is completely sound. In this storm, launching it will be dangerous, but staying here is becoming more dangerous by the hour. A tremendous crash echoed through the ship as something heavy broke loose on the deck above them. Alina could hear Captain Blackwood's voice bellowing orders, his words nearly drowned by the howling wind and the groaning of stressed timber. The storm was intensifying faster than anyone had anticipated. There's something you need to know. About the other passengers, Alina said, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper. The woman chained 3 sections over, Maria Santos. She's pregnant, maybe 6 months along. And the old man near the stern wall, Henrik, he has a lung condition. That makes breathing difficult even in calm weather. Tom was quiet for a moment, processing this information. Alina could see him weighing possibilities, calculating risks, grappling with the moral complexity of escape when others would be left behind. How many contracted passengers total? He asked finally. 11, including myself. 7 women, 3 men, 1 child. Alina had learned these details during the whispered conversations that took place when the guards changed shifts. Most are bound for arranged marriages or work contracts in Boston and New York. All of them signed agreements they couldn't read, in a language they barely understood. The ship pitched so violently that Elena's stomach lurched into her throat. Somewhere in the hold, glass shattered as bottles broke against their containers. Tom steadied himself and made a decision that Alina could see forming behind his eyes. We can't save everyone, he said, the words clearly painful for him to speak. Or we can't leave everyone either. The longboat might hold for people safely. In these conditions, 5, if we're willing to risk it. Lena stared at him. You're talking about choosing who lives and who dies? I'm talking about saving who we can, instead of saving no one. Tom's voice carried the weight of someone who had wrestled with impossible choices before. Maria, because she's carrying a child. Henrik, because he's least likely to survive what Blackwood has planned. And you. What about the others? Tom was quiet for a long moment, listening to the storm rage above them. When he spoke again, His voice held a resolve that Alina recognized. As final, we get word to them about Blackwood's contingency plan. We tell them where the emergency axes are stored, how to break the chains if the worst happens. We give them a fighting chance, instead of leaving them helpless. He looked at Alina directly. It's not enough, but it's what we can do. The sound of boots on the ladder leading down to the hold made them both freeze. Tom quickly repositioned Alina's shackles and moved to a nearby support beam, pulling out his tools as if he had been inspecting the ship's structure all along. Alina closed her eyes and let her body go limp, feigning the exhaustion that wasn't far from the truth. First Mate Cross appeared in the entrance to their section, his face flushed from exertion and his clothes soaked with spray. Behind him, 2 crew members carried heavy iron bars and welding equipment. Hayes, Cross barked, "Finish whatever you're doing here and get topside. Captain needs every man working the pumps." His gaze swept over Alina with the casual indifference of someone looking at livestock. "And you, cargo, keep quiet down here. Any noise, any trouble, and you'll find yourself with a lot less breathing room." Tom gathered his tools with deliberate calm. "Just checking the support beam, sir. The storm's putting extra stress on the frame." Cross nodded curtly and turned to direct his men in positioning the iron bars. Alina watched through barely opened eyes as they began measuring the entrance to her section, calculating where to install the additional restraints that would turn the cargo hold into a prison. As Tom climbed toward the deck, he caught Alina's eye for just a moment. In that brief glance, she saw everything they hadn't had time to say. The plan was in motion, ready or not. Tonight, during the height of the storm, they would discover whether freedom was worth the price they were about to pay. The welding torches cast eerie shadows across the cargo hold as Cross and his men worked to install the iron barriers. Listen to the rhythmic hammering and the hiss of hot metal, each sound marking another step toward complete imprisonment. Above the noise of construction, the storm continued its assault on the iron promise, sending shudders through the ship's frame that made the welding work dangerous and slow. Maria Santos lay curled against a grain sack 3 sections away, her hands pressed protectively over her swollen belly as another wave sent cargo sliding across the deck. The young woman had been seasick for days, but now Alina could see something else in her pale features, the kind of fear that came from understanding exactly how expendable they all were in Captain Blackwood's calculations. Henrik coughed violently from his position near the stern wall, each spasm echoing off the metal bulkheads. The old man's breathing had grown more labored as the storm intensified, the damp air and constant motion aggravating whatever condition had weakened his lungs. Alina watched him struggle and felt the weight of Tom's impossible choice settling in her chest. How do you decide who deserves salvation when everyone deserves to live? The welding stopped abruptly as the ship pitched through a series of massive swells that sent sparks flying from Cross's torch. Alina heard him curse and order his men to secure their equipment until the vessel stabilized. In the temporary quiet that followed, she became aware of a new sound, water dripping steadily somewhere in the darkness beyond her section. Cross noticed it too, called for lanterns and began inspecting the hull where it curved away into shadow. Alina watched his face change as the light revealed what they had all been dreading. A thin stream of seawater was forcing its way through a seam in the ship's planking, creating a steady drip that was already forming a puddle on the deck. "Get Blackwood down here now," Cross snapped at one of his men. "Tell him we've got water coming in through the port side hull, Section 4. The crew members scrambled up the ladder while Cross examined the leak more closely. Alina could see him calculating flow rates and structural integrity, the same cold assessment that reduced human lives to numbers on a manifest. She knew what conclusion he would reach long before Captain Blackwood's heavy boots announced his arrival in the hold. Blackwood surveyed the leak with the practiced eye of someone who had faced crisis at sea before. His weathered face showed no emotion as he watched seawater trickle into his cargo hold, but Alina caught the tension in his shoulders as he weighed his options. "Long before this becomes critical," he asked Cross, "or to say in these conditions, could be ours, could be less if the storm gets worse. The pumps can handle this volume for now, but if more seams open up..." Cross left the sentence unfinished. Blackwood nodded grimly and turned to survey the contracted passengers chained throughout the hold. His gaze lingered on each of them, with the calculating stare of a merchant evaluating which goods to save and which to sacrifice. Alina forced herself to meet his eyes when they settled on her, refusing to look away even as her heart hammered against her ribs. "Finish the barrier installation on the essential sections only," Blackwood ordered. "Leave the rest accessible. For now, if we need to lighten the load quickly, I want options." Alina's blood turned to ice as she understood the implication. Blackwood was preparing to throw them overboard if the leak worsened, but he wanted to choose which ones to sacrifice when the moment came. The iron barriers would protect the passengers he considered most valuable while leaving others exposed to his emergency decisions. As Cross resumed his welding work, focusing now only on the sections that housed the youngest women, Alina realized that Tom's timeline had just accelerated beyond their control. Whatever plan he had devised for their escape would have to happen. Soon, storm or no storm, ready or not. The hours that followed felt like an eternity measured in heartbeats and the steady drip of seawater onto wooden decking. Alina used the time to study every detail of her surroundings, memorizing the locations of emergency equipment and noting which cargo containers might provide cover during their escape attempt. She also watched the other passengers, trying to determine who might be strong enough to help and who would need protection. Maria caught her attention during one of the brief lulls in the storm's intensity. The pregnant woman gestured subtly toward a loose board in the deck near her position, indicating that she had been working to pry it free. Alina realized that the other passengers had not been sitting passively waiting for rescue. They had been preparing to fight. Henrik surprised her most of all. Despite his labored breathing and obvious physical weakness, the old man had somehow obtained a small knife, probably from a food preparation area, and was carefully working at the bolts that secured his chains to the ship's frame. His movements were slow and deliberate, designed to avoid detection by the guards who checked on them periodically. Alina began to understand that Tom's plan, whatever it involved, would not be a simple rescue of helpless victims. The contracted passengers had been planning their own resistance, and Tom's assistance might be the catalyst that turned desperate hope into coordinated action. The ship lurched violently as it crested a wave larger than any they had encountered so far. The impact, when the Iron Promise crashed back into the trough, sent shock waves through the hull that Alina could feel in her bones. Somewhere in the darkness, she heard new sounds, the groan of stressed timber and the ominous crack of metal under pressure. Cross appeared at the entrance to her section, his face grim with news that confirmed Alina's worst fears. The leak had expanded, joined by 2 more breaches that were allowing seawater to pour into the hold at an alarming rate. Captain Blackwood had made his decision about reducing the ship's weight, and Cross was there to begin the selection process. You, and you, he said, pointing at Alina Maria, and a young woman named Catherine, who had been bound for a work contract in New York. You're being moved to a secure section. The rest stay here. Alina's heart sank as she realized what this meant. Blackwood had chosen to save the 3 youngest women, while abandoning the others to whatever fate awaited them if the ship continued taking on water. She caught Henrik's eye and saw that he understood too. The old man nodded slightly, a gesture that somehow conveyed both acceptance and determination. As Cross began unlocking Alina's chains, she heard a sound that made her pulse race with sudden hope. From somewhere above them came the unmistakable rhythm of Tom's hammer, tapping out a pattern against the ship's hull that she had learned to recognize during their brief conversations. 3 short taps, 3 long, 3 short again. It was a signal, a message that only she would understand. Tom was ready to begin their escape, and he was telling her that the time for waiting had ended. The explosion of splintering wood echoed through the hold as Tom's crowbar found its mark against the weakened support beam. Alina felt her chains go slack as the entire restraint system collapsed, freeing not just herself but Henrik and 2 other passengers who had been chained to the same structural point. Above them, the storm provided perfect cover for the sound of their escape. While Cross and his men battled the increasing leaks in the forward sections, Tom appeared through the smoke and confusion, his face streaked with soot and determination. He pulled Alina to her feet while Maria struggled upright. One hand pressed against her belly as another contraction seized her. The baby was coming whether they escaped or not, and Alina realized their timeline had compressed to mere minutes. "The boat is ready," Tom shouted over the noise of the storm and the chaos of the sinking ship. "But we move now, or not at all." Henrik stumbled toward them, his breathing ragged but his eyes burning with fierce resolve. "Go," he wheezed, pressing the small knife he had stolen into Elena's hand. "Take the women and the child that's coming. Some of us were never meant to see Boston anyway." Alina looked into the old man's face and saw a peace that transcended fear. Henrik had found his purpose in these final moments, and that purpose was ensuring that others lived to see freedom. She squeezed his weathered hand once, understanding passing between them without words. Tom led them through the collapsing hold, past overturned cargo and rising water, toward a ladder that would take them to the deck where their small boat waited. As they climbed toward an uncertain future, Lena heard Henrik's voice rising above the storm, calling out instructions to the remaining passengers about emergency axes and escape routes. The old man had chosen to become their guardian angel, buying them precious time with his sacrifice. The deck of the Iron Promise was a battlefield of wind and water, but Tom guided them through the chaos with the confidence of someone who knew every inch of the ship. The longboat hung in its davits, already loaded with supplies and ready for launch. As Maria collapsed into the boat with another contraction, Lena took one last look at the ship that had carried her toward slavery and saw instead the place where she had learned what freedom truly meant. Tom pushed them away from the dying vessel, and Alina Rossetti found herself rowing toward a horizon that held no guarantees except the promise that she would write her own story from this moment forward. Behind them, the Iron Promise settled deeper into the Atlantic, but ahead lay Philadelphia, a new name, and a love that had been born in the space between cargo and humanity. Years later, when people asked Alina Hayes how she knew her husband was the right man, she would tell them about the night he looked at chains and saw a person who deserved to choose her own destiny. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.